life as we know it can be kind of crazy. That's why technology kind of failed us earlier today. Technology fails us all the time, but life, like I'm sure we all can agree, can be kind of crazy. But today I want to talk a little bit about just trusting God despite all of the craziness. So if you could, we could turn to Judges 6 while you're at it, Judges 6. And just keep your finger there. We all want a quality life, right? That's why we go to the extent or the extremes of living in crazy neighborhoods just to be close to some of the best schools. That's why we go to the extremes of working overtime just to make a few more bucks. That's why we go to the extreme of using those few more bucks that we have to buy organic food. Because we all want to live a quality life. And I know for a lot of us, a quality life can be very subjective. A quality life may not be the exact same thing for you as it is for me, but I know one of the common denominators that I feel like we all can agree on is that quality life is a life of meaning, a life that really makes the most of the opportunities that we have, a life that's great. And today I wanted to share one simple truth, that the quality of our lives is determined by the obedience in our lives. See, the key to a quality life is an obedient one. And the Bible tells us and shows us time and time again of just how God has always been right and how God's way has always been better. And just to be clear, to start off, I'm not saying that a quality life equals an easy life. In fact, life comes with a lot of challenges despite who you are. But despite the hardships, I am saying that with God, you can still find joy. Despite the pain and suffering, with God, you can still find comfort. Despite the chaos and everything kind of being unpredictable, you can still find this sense of peace. A life that really does make a difference. A life that only a relationship with God can provide. This high quality life. So today we're going to look at a passage of a people who had to learn this the hard way. And we're going to turn to Judges chapter 6. And I'm actually going to start in verse 6. Judges chapter 6, verse 6. And it says, the Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. So I'm just going to kind of go through and summarize what had kind of been going on. What we're looking here is the Israelites. And the Israelites, for those who don't know it, were God's chosen people. They were hand-selected by God to be used by God. And at this point, though God said, when you enter the land that I've given to you, the chosen land, you will receive milk. It'll be great. Milk, the land of milk and honey. There we go. It'll be great. But what we see here is that they actually are miserable. Their life actually is pretty messed up. Verse 1 points out why, and it says, because the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, like a lot of us, we had to learn this the hard way, that when we turn our backs on God, that God had their back regardless, but they turned their backs on God. And what happened is they had to go through a series of consequences that lasted for 7 years. Israel had a bit of a habit of trusting God and then losing trust in God and then choosing to do things right in their own eyes rather than in God's eyes. And we see in passages like Joshua, and we see the beginning of Judges, how God would use someone like Joshua and Deborah to lead the Israelites, and they would just dominate, right? These were like a people that were nobody and just kind of stepped up on the scene when they started to trust God. And what they did to get into the promised land is they had to go through a series of other people that had already lived there. And to get to those people, they didn't just say, okay, we're going to give you our land. They had to go and defeat those people. And with God, what they did is all they could do was win. And then the one time when they chose not to trust God, they lost. And it just goes to show the man with God, the only thing that you do is win. And what this led to was this great time of peace in Israel. And the peace led to them, instead of trusting God more, of getting kind of comfortable and complacent. To where God told them to keep moving forward, keep going east. And what they did is they just kind of stopped and stayed put. They stopped growing, they stopped progressing. And then it reveals later why they stopped progressing. And what had happened was they were paralyzed by their fear of their next opponent. And what ended up happening was they started becoming just like the people that were around them. They started worshiping the gods that the people around them worshiped. They started doing the things, the ways that the people around them did. Trying to fit in and make friends with the enemy, breaking their relationship with God. And they basically broke up with God like a relationship and tried to move on their own, and they failed miserably. Life ended up being a living hell. Because life without God is just that. And Israel got to experience that for 7 years. For us to go years later and look back and say, man, I'd rather take my chances with God than take chances without him. The Midianites were compared to locusts. And what locusts are like a species of grasshopper. And what they do is they fly in swarms. And they come in, they strip fields, and they cause damage to crops. And the reason the Bible compares the Midianites and the Easterners that were the enemies of the Israelites to grasshoppers is because that's exactly what the Midianites did to God's people. They basically started to bully them. And I don't know if when you were in middle school, you tried to fit in with the wrong crowd, and then they started to make fun of you. But this is basically what was going on in Israel at the time. And they pushed them around for 7 years before Israel was humble enough to cry out to God. Basically, what would happen is the gangs from the east, which we'll call the Midianites, east side, came in and they swept and just destroyed everything in sight. Everything that Israel worked for, stealing every crop, every ox, every sheep, every donkey. And what they couldn't grab, they would just burn, ravage homes and communities, and then they would flee off in the coolest way on camelback. And what they would do is they would wait until the next harvest and do the exact same thing all over again. So you can only imagine what the Israelites were going through, to where everything they had worked for little by little was taken away from them. And they were forced to not just be out in the open, but they were forced to hide in mountain clefts and in caves. And they became poor with no food or no resources because the Midianites stripped those things from them. And this lasted for 7 years before they were humble enough to reach out to God. This is just a picture, it's a very pixelated picture, of what grasshoppers can do to crops. As you see on the left, you see green. When a swarm of grasshoppers come, they leave it sort of like the picture on the right. And this just kind of brings me to something that I really wanted to highlight, is that the enemies of God's people are always out to steal the blessings of God's people. And we see in John chapter 10, how it talks about the thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. And this was something that didn't start when it was today. This is something that's been going on for all of eternity. Satan is always out to steal, kill, and destroy. The enemies of God are always out to take the blessings of God. But isn't it encouraging that we serve such a God that when we cry out to him, he swoops in and saves the day? Despite how far we've gone, despite how much we've messed up, God is still willing to come and help us out. Isaiah 59 talks about The Lord's ear is surely not too dull to hear, and his arm is not too short to save. And we see time and time in life, through the Bible and in our own lives, how God does just that. And notice they didn't just talk to God, but they cried out to God. There's a bit of humility there. And I think that's a bit of a difference that a lot of times we can mix up. God will let us have it our way for as long as it takes for us to see that his way is better. And that's something that I've seen time and time and time again in my own life. I didn't get baptized until I was 19. I wish I had listened to God earlier, because it would have really saved me a lot of trouble and heartache in my life, instead of listening to the enemy who only wanted to destroy it. And we're going to pick up in this next scene, we pick up with this character by the name of Gideon, which I'm sure a lot of you probably have heard of. If not, he's an awesome character. Gideon is one of like the 4th or the 5th judges in Israel. Not to be confused with Judge Judy, he's Judge Gideon. And we start off with this scene of Gideon, who at the time is just a farmer. And in verse 11 of chapter 6, it says, "The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the brook in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, 'The Lord is with you, mighty warrior.'" So we see here how Gideon, at the time when the angel approaches him, is threshing wheat in a winepress. And for those who don't know what threshing wheat is, join the club. But I looked it up. Threshing wheat is a process, and I'm going to read this because I'll butcher it if I don't. Threshing wheat is a process of separating the edible part of the crop from the non-edible part of chaff that surrounds it. This is basically performed at the end of harvest. What farmers would usually do is beat the edible parts of the crop off of the chaff which wasn't edible. I found a modern picture of sort of what this looks like. So that's just one way of doing it. There's a couple of different ways of doing it. Depends on where you're from. If you're from Broward, we don't do it at all. So we go to Whole Foods where it's made for us. It's already taken care of. Anyways, so this is sort of what it looks like, what would take place. And what they would do is they would separate the chaff from the grain, which was the edible part. And I found this definition online that I think that really kind of stood out to me, but it said the basic principle of threshing remains the same. It says to agitate the crop and separate the grain from the chaff. And I love that definition because later we'll see that that's basically what God does with his people. This separation. When we choose to do things our way, we find that we make things harder on ourselves. Gideon at this time is doing his thing in a wine press. And that might sound like normal activity if you're not a farmer. But this process was usually done out in the open because what they would try to do is for the wind to pick up and separate the chaff, making the thing a little bit easier. But Gideon was in this enclosed dugout, basically. And I had a picture. But Gideon was in sort of like, imagine like kind of like this dugout where you're supposed to press fruit. That's how you make wine. Learn something new every day. He was enclosed in this dugout with no access to wind, and he actually basically just made things a lot harder on himself because of his disobedience to God. Because of his disobedience to God, him and a lot of the other Israelites were forced to hide and live in fear of their crops in their lives, separating chaff in a dugout, in a hole, rather than out in the open where they should be. When we choose to do things our way, it really does affect our quality of life. Israel was forced to hide from their enemies just to survive, an enemy that God said that he would help them to defeat. But because they chose not to listen and they chose to do things their own way, they were forced to have it their way. And this led to the misery that I just spoke about. And I think a lot of times with me in my life, man, I'm really no different. And maybe some people can kind of relate, right? When God says not to lie, and then I still slip up and do it, and then I wonder why people can't trust me anymore. Or when God says not to steal, and I still do it. Luckily, I haven't gotten the record. Well, I don't do it anymore. Let me make that clear. Amen. I know y'all looking at your eyes got big, and I was like, what did I just say? Let me follow up. So, I don't steal, but God says not to steal, which is why I don't steal, because a lot of people who do steal now have it on their record. All right, God says to honor our father and mother, and what ends up happening is we break that relationship. God says to forgive, and then we end up being sick with bitterness. God says to share our faith, and then before we know it, we don't have any to share because we don't obey God when God says to obey. When we do things our way, we really do make things harder on ourselves, and Christianity, though it's very simple, becomes very, very difficult. Just simply by disobedience. So we see Gideon here, and he's in a very difficult situation. Circumstances are very bad. He is hiding from the enemy in fear, and God, like he always does, comes in and saves the day. He sends an angel. And what he calls Gideon, he comes to him, and the way that he addresses him is he says, look, the Lord is with you, mighty warrior. Now, Gideon at this time is probably looking around to see who he's talking about, because Gideon's only a farmer, right? Gideon probably has never even held a sword, right? But he comes to him and he declares, like, the Lord is with you, you mighty warrior. And I think this really does serve as a crucial reminder that I pray that we all take with us today, that God doesn't come to tear us down, he comes to lift us up. I think when I was reading this, I was waiting for Gideon to get it. I'm like, usually when angels come, it's bad news. In this case, an angel came and he's like, look, I'm here to make you more than what you actually are. And I think God does that so often in our lives. Maybe you made some mistakes in your life that you feel like it's just too big for God to kind of throw away. I'm here to tell you today that God is willing to throw it away if you're willing to obey. Really. God goes after the screw-ups to lift them up and make them a lot greater than they were before, if we're willing to humble and hear him out. And what God's going to do in this situation is he's going to raise up a mere farmer to save his people from the hands of tormentors that have lasted for 7 years too long. Let's jump to verse 13. Pardon me, Lord, Gideon replied, but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all the signs and wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, did not the Lord bring us out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian. And I'm only going to stop on that verse just to point out that God doesn't abandon us, we abandon God. And a lot of times we feel that way because of the mistakes that we've made in life, and we look back and we look for someone to blame, and God's the only one there. I can't tell you how many times people, why didn't God dive in and do something about God chooses to be God? Just stay with God and he won't abandon you, but don't abandon God. Verse 14. The Lord turned to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you? Then Gideon says, pardon me, my Lord. But how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. The Lord answered, I will be with you and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. God tells Midian to go out and strike his oppressors, which is what he wanted. And Midian immediately strikes down himself. And this passage just kind of shows just how much God has faith in people that don't have very much faith in themselves. When God is calling us to do something greater than ourselves, a lot of times we can automatically think less of ourselves. Even though he proclaims how great we are, we can make excuses like, man, I'm just too weak. I'm just a nobody. I'm too tired. I'm not good enough. I'm not strong enough. A lot of times what stops God's people from making progress is that they're too busy making excuses. This heart really does keep us from making progress in our own lives. It keeps us from the victories that God has already handed to us. And this heart really does keep us from seeing ourselves as God does see us. You probably have no idea how highly God thinks of you, because a lot of times we think so lowly of ourselves. Does that make sense? You know, it's characters like Moses that actually inspired me when I was studying the Bible, because I feel like this is sort of like exactly what happened with Moses, right? God said to him, go out and save his people. And then what Moses does is he makes excuses. And that just goes to show that, man, our insecurities really can hinder or improve our quality of life. I'm going to go back. Boom. Really does hinder our quality of life. I'm sorry. At the end of my senior year of college, I was approached by one of the VPs, one of the vice presidents, because I worked next door to his office. And he approached me one day, basically asking me, what are your future plans? And I was like, I don't know. Like, graduate? That was pretty much it. I was like, graduate, get out of my mama's house, figure out life from there. And he's like, man, look, you should go to grad school. Have you ever thought about grad school? And I was like, yeah, I thought about it. And my conclusion was nope. Because I was tired of school. It was already 4 years too long. I was actually ready to be done after high school. I went to college because my mom was like, you got to do something with your life, boy. So I got up and did what she told me to do, and amen. But I thought about it, and I said, I'm not going to do it. And he's like, man, you would be great for this. He's like, look, I can tell you're like a people person. You ever thought about working with people? It's like, yeah, just not in grad school. And then what he says, he's like, look, like I'm offering you, I have a new student assistant position available, and I'm looking for a grad student. You know, my first thought was like, man, look, like I don't do what you do, basically. I'm like, I'm here for graphic design. I chose the easy way out. He's like, no, that's okay. I'm like, look, like, you know what? I can't even afford it. He's like, I'll pay for it. Like, this dude was literally I know. And I don't know what it was. We only had a couple of interactions. I worked next door. Maybe somebody else put in a good word for me. But he was like, man, I'll even pay for it. So I said, keep going. So he goes on, he goes off, he's like, man, look here, don't worry, like, I'll take care of everything, I'll make this happen. And you know, I thought long and hard for about 10 seconds. And I politely said, no thanks. Learn from my mistakes, teenies. I politely said, no thanks, I would love to chat, but I'm late for a class that starts in 2 hours. And I left, and that was it. I don't even remember if I saw the guy again. I think I was too afraid to show my face because I didn't know what he was gonna think of me. But who knows, man, by now I probably could have been president of the United States of America if I had taken that opportunity. You had... But basically, man, the reason why I was honestly too afraid to try And I think a lot of times, like I was saying, like our insecurities really can hinder us from improving our quality of life. And I don't know if you've ever thought to yourself just how God has given so many of us a lot of the same opportunities, and the reason why we don't do it, once we get to the bottom line, is some sort of fear. I don't know if you ever stopped to think to yourself how many opportunities God has given you to do and be something greater than yourself that you yourself probably shot down before he could even do something with it. So the next time God calls you, don't say, "Pardon me, Lord." Say, "Jesus is Lord," and go through with it. Because turning down opportunities really can affect not just you, but the people around you. But the thing I love about God is how he constantly encourages Gideon throughout this passage. I'm not going to be able to read it all, but the part I really wanted to zoom in on was when he says to go in your own strength. And here's the game changer, because I will be with you. When God says he's with you, look, it's said and done. Right? I can't think of one time to where God said that to someone, they trusted him and they failed. Right? God has always been victorious. He still hasn't lost. It's been over 2,000 years. Right? So you can only imagine if God kind of sends you to do something, just how quick you should be to respond. Joshua's battles, he was always the underdog. Right? You look at Joshua, they were always the underdogs, but time after time they would just be victorious, time and time and time again. And the one time where they went without God, they lost. And then they trusted God again, and then they started winning again. If God wants us to really do something with you, honestly, what more do you need? Right? When God is with you, you automatically are at a significant advantage. Right? Yesterday, was it yesterday? Yesterday we were playing bubble soccer. That's where that picture came from. Now you can go to the next one. Click. Bubble. All right, there we go. Yesterday we were playing bubble soccer, which is a really, really fun and intense game when you play with certain people. But you get inside of the bubbles and you basically play soccer. So people are falling around, flipping, twirling. It's hard to get back up on your feet once you fall down. But yesterday as we were playing, the referees would come in and they would separate, the middle schooler and high schoolers. They would try to make it kind of balanced out. They would kind of throw a bunch of middle schoolers on one team and a bunch of high schoolers on another. No, they would mix it out. And what happened was there was one point where a significant amount of high schoolers were on one team against a significant amount of middle schoolers. And what this referee, who's paid to do this, chose to do is he puts in Chris Cordeal on the middle school squad. Now, Chris isn't here today, but Chris is like half man, half ox. Chris is not small. He's bigger than all of our youth ministry combined, alone. So he puts in Chris. And if you need a demonstration, you're having a hard time picture Chris. He's just this muscular, big, huge guy. He's like me, just significantly taller. So just imagine me just like Matt Blair's height, right? I'm up there. Me, Chris, right? So Chris gets in to balance everything out, or so we thought. I turned my back for 1 second, and it's the funniest thing. Like I wish I'm not even lying. You just hear kids just dropping like bowling pins. Just rolling all over the field. You see people's legs flailing up in the air. And the funny thing about it is I was going to go and talk to Chris and say, hey, go easy on them. But he was jogging the whole time. I kid you not. It was embarrassing. Which is why they're so quiet right now, because they know it's the truth. No casualties were reported lost. Teams were exhausted, but let me tell you from the start, they didn't stand a chance. Chris creamed them by himself. I look back. I'm gonna end the story in 5 seconds. I look back and all I hear is goal, score, goal, score, goal. Half the time it was Chris against the high schoolers. Done deal. And I say that only to say that a lot of times it's like that with God, right? To where God is just so much bigger and stronger to where you are at a significant advantage no matter who you play against, right? God makes up for the things that we lack, and he makes it even greater. My clicker isn't working. So God's ability to use you doesn't really depend very much on you. What God can do through you has very little to do with who you are or what you even are, right? And we see throughout passages in the scripture how time and time again that's been proven, right? God took 5,000 people and fed them with just 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, right? An insane miracle that's still talked about today. And he did the same thing again with 4,000. There was one time where Elijah ran into a widow whose son was dying, and all she had was a little jar of oil and a little jar of flour, and her thing was like, we're just gonna eat this until we die. And then God comes in and he stretches it for days to come. And God says time and time again, look, with faith the size of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. And I think God is just trying to tell us and remind us that, look, like I'll make up for what's lacking. Right? 2 weeks ago, we sent out our big three. 3 campus students from Broward went out to Brazil. One of them spoke Portuguese. One of them. 2 of them, they worked on it, but they left here speaking English. I know because I heard their attempts, but they left full of faith. And it just goes to show that, man, like, they left here believing that God will fill in for what they lack, right? God will be the one to fill in the blanks, and he's going to use them to do something powerfully. And I can't wait for the update. Just FYI, I heard this morning that they're doing great, and it's only been a week, right? So just imagine what God is going to do a year from now. So I'm not going to be able to read all of this. We're running low on time, but what ends up happening is God goes through like these series of like miracles for Gideon. Like Gideon's having a hard time trusting that God is going to be with him. And what God does is what he asks to prove that, yeah, I'm going to be with you. And I think this really does illustrate a simple point that I'm not really going to float on, but that God doesn't just want us to obey him. I think he really does want us to trust him as well. And he goes as far as he could to prove to Gideon that he was with him. Let's talk about the fight. So in chapter 7, this is where it gets real, right? God confirms that he's with Gideon, and Gideon says, I'm going to go out with whatever boys I can gather together. And he gains the courage to first go and tear down the idols in his town, in his father's backyard, and he gathers up all of these Joe Smos from around the community. He gathers up about 32,000 men, which is a lot. And what God says to him is that's still too many. Send all of the scaredy cats back home. That's basically what he said. Go back and read it for yourself. I'm paraphrasing. Every fearful and faithless man left and went back to their comfortable homes. 22,000 healthy fighting men left because God said, I don't want to work with them. They're too fearless. Israel is now down to only 10,000 people. And then, like God, he said, look, that's still too many. And then he takes them from 10,000 and dwindles it down to 300, basically just sort of sifting through the wheat, the useful from the unuseful. And God does this because God says, I want them to know that it's not by their strength that they did it, but by mine. And the 300 soldiers, the way that he comes to that conclusion is he says, I don't want the scaredy cats, I want all of the weirdos that lap like dogs. I think because God wanted beasts on his army. And what ended up happening was he took what they had, which was 32,000 men, and dwindled it down to 300, which might still sound like a lot back then. Until you read forward and find out that they were facing the Midianites and the people of the east. And they had 135,000 people. So what God put them in this position to where it was 300 men versus 135,000 men. It went from a ratio of 4-1 to 450 to every one soldier that Israel had. They go from lacking resources to lacking resources even more. And in this position that only God can pull them through. And they had to trust God or go back to being oppressed by the Midianites. And then that's when God said, okay, go, for you're ready. And then we'll pick up with God's great plan on how he's going to win this war. Verse 16, it says, dividing the 3 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them, with torches inside. He says, watch me, he told them, follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly what I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp, blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. No swords, no shields. The plan was to go up to 135,000 soldiers and basically yell really loud. For the Lord and for Gideon. And if this sounds crazy to you or insane, it's because it is. And what you would expect is for these guys to just get destroyed by these people. But like I was saying before, when you're with God, you have a significant advantage. God doesn't want for things to just be hard on us. He wants things to be impossible for us so that he can come through and show you just how incredible he actually is. Life might feel sometimes like it's hard to trust God, but I'd rather be anxious and trust God than anxious without him. And we all get to see firsthand, because of Israel's obedience, what happens when a people who don't stand a chance take a stand with God. Verse 19. In verse 19, it says, Gideon and the 300, when them they reached out to the edge of the camp, beginning of the middle watch. Just after they changed the guard, they blew the trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hand and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were blown, and shouted, a sword for the Lord and a sword for Gideon. And I'm going to have to paraphrase for the rest of the story. So they go out, and they not only scream, but to make matters even crazier, they just start breaking ceramics, all of their pots and stuff, breaking it, shattering it, and screaming really loud, and they got fire torches in their hand. And what ends up happening is the Midianites look up at them. Keep in mind that this is about 10 o'clock at night, so it's super dark. They didn't have flashlights back then, so they were just sitting in the pitch dark. They're sleeping, and they wake up out of their sleep to all of this craziness and chaos. And because they can't see even their hands in front of them, they start killing everything that's around them. And what ends up happening is, in the chaos, in the midst of everything going wrong, they start basically destroying their own armies and killing their own men. And God took those 300 men and he won with them. Even when the odds are stacked up against you, when God is with you, nothing can really stand against you. A scripture I love that I think has really been demonstrated in this passage, it says, the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. And if this passage doesn't show that, I don't know what passage does. And I'm going to have to cut it short, but what ended up happening in Judges 8 is it basically ends by saying the Midianites were ran out of town by the Israelites. The 300 won the war against 135,000. And it says that during Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace for 40 years. The quality of our lives is really determined by just how obedient we are in our lives, right? God does so much through our obedience. Let's pray.